Sir, I have both hands out the window. Please don't hurt me. Hurt you? I haven't even started. Get out, or you're getting sprayed. Marcus didn't even finish drawing breath before Officer Kyle Barrett stepped in, lifted the canister, and fired pepper spray straight into his eyes at point-blank range, hitting him so hard and so fast that his scream came out broken. The shock stole the air from his chest. His hands, which had been open and visible, shot toward his face on instinct. And Barrett's voice thundered again, accusing him of resisting when all Marcus could do was gasp against the burn that felt like fire spreading across his skin. Before we go into this story, tell me where you're watching from, and if you're here to follow stories of courage, accountability, and the truth behind moments like this. Subscribe to the channel and give me a like. Your support helps bring these stories to the people who need to hear them. The pepper spray spread through Marcus's eyes and throat as if it had a will of its own. His vision blurred into a wet streak of red and white. He coughed, choking on every breath, trying to speak, but unable to form a single clear sentence. Another door slammed. Another set of boots hit the ground. Backup arrived so quickly it felt rehearsed. Officer Daniel Crocker moved in on the passenger side, shouting orders that Marcus couldn't understand through the pain. His hands clawed at the empty air. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't pulling away. He was simply trying to survive the searing shock that had taken control of every nerve in his face. Barrett grabbed his arm with a force that pulled Marcus sideways out of the seat. His knees hit the pavement first, then his shoulder. Then his face pressed against cold concrete. The pain was sharp, but the humiliation was sharper. His body curled as another voice yelled, "Stop resisting!" Though Marcus had not moved except to cry out, he felt a heavy knee jam into the back of his leg, forcing it flat. His wrists were yanked behind him, twisted until he gasped, and the cuffs snapped tight enough to cut into the skin. "I'm a soldier," he managed to say, coughing through the burn. "I'm afraid to get shot." Barrett didn't answer. He didn't slow down. He tightened the cuffs one more notch and pushed Marcus forward with the careless pressure of a man handling luggage instead of a living person. Marcus tried to pull air into his lungs, but each breath came sharp and painful. His mind flashed to nights overseas when danger came without warning, nights when he had to remind himself to breathe, to stay focused, to keep moving. But here, in his home state, in a gas station he had visited 100 times, the fear felt worse because it came from men in uniforms that were supposed to protect citizens like him. His chest tightened as he lay on the pavement, tasting metal, pepper spray, and rain all mixing together. Crocker hovered nearby, giving quick updates into his radio, calling it a high-risk stop and mentioning something about a temporary plate. Marcus heard the words but couldn't hold on to them. They drifted in and out of his consciousness as he tried to keep his body still. Every movement sent another wave of pain through his face and down his neck. He kept his eyes squeezed shut because opening them only made the burn stronger. When the officers finally pulled him into a seated position on the curb, his legs trembled so much he could barely keep them folded under him. Rain slid down his cheeks, but it did nothing to ease the sting. His breath came in quick, ragged pulls. He fought the urge to vomit. He fought the urge to scream again. He fought the urge to let the memories swallow him whole. Barrett paced in front of him, shaking his head as if disappointed. Didn't listen. He muttered. Didn't comply. Marcus tried to answer, but the words caught in the tightness of his throat. He bent forward slightly, trying to calm himself, trying to slow the pounding in his chest. The world looked smeared, as though someone had dragged a wet cloth across his vision. It took a long moment before he noticed his own phone lying on the ground a few feet away. The screen was cracked. The camera light was still on. It had been recording since the moment the first order was shouted. He had not planned it. His fingers had simply moved, tapping the screen the way they had seen others do in moments of crisis. He didn't know that this recording, lying in the rain, picking up every word and every blow, would become the single piece of evidence that would change his life. He only knew that he wished Evelyn were still alive to tell him to breathe, to keep his eyes open, to remind him that he had survived worse. The thought of her brought a quiet ache to his chest. Her voice was the only thing that could steady him, but tonight, it was only a memory. Barrett leaned down, studying him with a look that carried annoyance rather than concern. "Next time someone tells you to get out, you get out," he said, as if Marcus hadn't been begging for a chance to speak. "You're lucky we didn't go further." Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't. The only sound he managed was a weak exhale through clenched teeth. His hands were numb. His shoulders shook. His eyes refused to stop burning. Crocker finally walked over with a towel, not to help, but to wipe the pepper spray off his own gloves. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't acknowledge the pain. He simply kept talking with Barrett about radio codes, paperwork, and the aggressive behavior they would write down. It was as if Marcus were an object, not a man who had done everything he could to stay alive that night. As the minutes passed, Marcus forced his gaze downward and found the patch on his sleeve. The Army flag. The symbol he had worn through deployments, through loss, through the hardest years of his life. The patch was smeared with dirt and pepper spray. His lieutenant bars were scratched where they had scraped the concrete. He stared at them until his vision steadied enough for him to swallow the rising humiliation. He whispered to himself, more fragile than he meant to be. "I'm still here." The words weren't loud. They weren't meant for the officers. They were meant for the woman he loved, the woman he lost, and the part of himself that had survived everything except silence. Tonight. That silence shattered. Marcus Leon Thompson had spent most of his life mastering the art of swallowing pain. And the night at the Exxon station forced open memories he had worked for years to bury. As he sat alone in his small living room the next morning, eyes still raw from the pepper spray and wrists marked from the cuffs, he could feel old wounds rising through him like smoke. He had always believed silence protected him, protected his family, and protected the men who served beside him. But every breath he took now carried the weight of all the years he had let the world look past him without protest. His life had never been a straight line, and every turn began long before he ever stepped into that gas station. He grew up on Lenox Avenue in Harlem, where the buildings leaned close together and every day reminded him how narrow a boy's future could be if he didn't run fast enough or stay invisible long enough. His father worked nights. His mother cleaned apartments, and Marcus learned early that the safest path was the quiet one, when trouble walked down the block. He crossed the street, when tempers rose. He kept his head down. Silence was not weakness back then. It was survival. When he turned 18, he knew he had to leave before the neighborhood chewed him up like so many others. Enlisting in the Army felt like stepping into a world where discipline mattered more than where you came from. The uniform gave him a purpose, a structure, a direction that Harlem had never offered. He wore it with pride, but he also carried a private fear each time he walked through the gates of a new base. He knew what happened to men who looked like him when they were out in the world without protection, but he prayed the uniform would shield him from that. It never truly did. His first deployment to Iraq hardened him in ways he never spoke about. He learned to sleep in 1-hour bursts, learned to move before thinking, learned to keep his voice low even in moments of panic. Nights were the worst, nights when explosions lit the sky and the ground shook, nights when he woke reaching for a weapon, ready to defend himself, only to realize he was thousands of miles from home, standing in dust that never seemed to settle. It was during his second deployment that he felt something inside him crack. A roadside blast took out a Humvee he had been riding in minutes earlier. 2 men died. Another lost both legs. Marcus walked away with only a concussion, but he carried the guilt like a stone in his chest. He came home with medals he never displayed and nightmares he never discussed. Evelyn, the woman who had stood by him since he was 23, tried to help him through the worst of it. She was gentle, patient, and steady in the ways he never quite learned to be. She could read his quiet before he even opened his mouth. She knew when the memories were coming, when the nights grew long, when he paced the hallway instead of sleeping. She would put a hand on his arm and tell him he was still here, still whole, still loved. Her voice was the only thing that could quiet the storms inside him when she was diagnosed with cancer. The world narrowed again. He took her to every appointment, sat beside her during every treatment, and held her hand when the pain took all her strength. She fought hard, but the illness took her quickly, and the house grew silent in a way he had never imagined. The day she died. Marcus stopped talking almost entirely. He moved through life the way a man walks through fog, slowly, searching for something solid to hold on to. The VA therapy sessions were his attempt to find that solidity. Though he never expected healing, he would sit in those waiting rooms with other veterans, each one carrying their own weight, their own memories, their own ghosts. Some talked freely, some cried, some sat stone still for hours. Marcus fell somewhere in between. He listened more than he spoke. He nodded to show respect. He let the younger men unload their burdens because he knew the relief that came with saying out loud what had buried itself inside the chest. But when it came to his own pain, he stayed quiet. Silence had become his armor. Silence had become his way of protecting others from the battles he carried inside. And silence had become the last thing he still controlled after losing Evelyn. The VA therapists encouraged him to talk about racism he had faced during and after service. Moments he had brushed aside, comments he had walked past, the times he chose not to raise his voice even when the uniform on his chest should have guaranteed him respect. They told him silence helps the world forget the men who served, but talking felt like stepping into a room with no walls. He wasn't ready in the civilian world. He learned quickly how strangers saw him long before they saw his uniform or his history. Clerks watched him closely in stores. Drivers avoided eye contact at intersections. Officers questioned him when he walked in neighborhoods too quiet or too wealthy. Whenever he explained he was a veteran, some people softened, others stiffened. High-traffic areas near bases were known for stopping black service members more than anyone else. But Marcus always shrugged it off, telling himself not to make trouble. His approach was simple. Stay calm, stay polite, keep moving. Silence. Always silence. When Jamal grew into a young man and joined the Navy, Marcus felt a mix of pride and fear. Pride for the uniform carried into another generation. Fear because his son was living in a world where respect for black service members was inconsistent at best. He worried every time Jamal drove across a state line. He worried every time he saw a news headline. But he never shared those fears. Fathers are supposed to be strong, he told himself. Fathers are supposed to shield their children from the darkness, not hand it to them. The night at the Exxon station shattered the last of that shield. For the first time. Marcus understood that silence had not protected him. Silence had only made him easier to ignore. As he sat in his living room replaying every second of the encounter, he felt something shift inside him. The burn in his eyes had faded into a dull ache. But the humiliation lingered. The violence had touched a part of him he thought long dead. He had spent his entire adult life following rules, showing respect, moving carefully through the world. None of it stopped the canister from firing into his face. None of it stopped the hands from dragging him across concrete. None of it stopped the officer from treating his life as a threat before a single question was asked, for the first time since Evelyn died. A new feeling rose in his chest. Not anger, not fear. Something steadier, something clearer. A quiet understanding that silence was no longer the safest path. He could feel her voice in the back of his mind, gentle but firm, urging him to stand tall, urging him to speak, urging him to reclaim the pieces of himself the world kept trying to push aside. He whispered into the empty room, as if she were standing beside him. "I can't stay quiet this time." And for the first time in years, the words felt like truth. Marcus didn't post the video for a full week, not because he doubted what happened, but because every time he picked up the phone, his hands shook. He would open the gallery, press play, and watch himself begging with both hands out the window, hear his own voice pleading not to be hurt, watch Barrett fire that burst of pepper spray into his face, watch his body dragged and slammed onto the concrete, and feel his chest tighten as if the moment were happening again. Each viewing stole a little breath from him. Each viewing reminded him how small he had felt on that pavement, and each viewing brought back Evelyn's voice, the one that always told him to do the brave thing even when it scared him. On the 7th night, after sitting alone at the kitchen table for too long, he whispered her name, steadied his hand, and pressed post. He didn't add a caption. He didn't add a hashtag. He simply uploaded the raw footage and placed the phone face down on the table, trying to quiet the rush of emotion now spilling through him. The video didn't spread slowly. It erupted. Within the first hour, it gathered a few hundred views, mostly from locals. Within 6 hours, thousands. By morning, it had crossed state lines. The sound of Barrett shouting, the point-blank spray, the cries from Marcus as he tried to explain he was a soldier. Those moments cut through the screen like a blade. People watched the clip again and again, unable to look away. By the second day, it hit 1 million views. By the end of the second night, it had reached 5 million. Viewers from across the country sent messages, comments, and calls for justice. Veterans recognized the fear in Marcus's voice. Mothers recognized the terror of a man begging not to be harmed. Strangers recognized the unmistakable cruelty of the officer's actions. And through all of it, a single phrase began to appear everywhere: justice for Marcus. Protests formed faster than Marcus ever expected. By the 3rd day, people stood outside the Suffolk Police Department holding signs with the words he had spoken on camera. "I'm afraid to get shot." News vans lined the sidewalk. Reporters argued for space near the entrance. Local leaders called for transparency. Civil rights groups demanded an investigation. And through the noise of the crowd, television anchors repeated a truth the video made undeniable. A black man in uniform had begged for mercy in a city that claimed to honor service. And still, he was met with force. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, overwhelmed by the rapid attention, unsure how to feel. Part of him wanted to disconnect from everything. Part of him felt exposed in a way he never imagined. And another part, small but growing, felt a strange sense of relief, as though the silence he had carried for decades had finally cracked open. But the weight of being seen, truly seen, after a lifetime of wanting to disappear, was almost too much for him to bear. He kept his phone on the dresser, screen facing away, trying to shield himself from the world he had accidentally pulled inside his home. Then came the call that pierced through all his restraint. It was nearly 3 in the morning when his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number, but the area code told him everything. San Diego, his son, Jamal. Marcus answered, expecting a steady voice, the calm tone of a Navy master-at-arms who had seen his share of trouble. Instead, he heard trembling breath followed by 5 words spoken too slowly to hide the pain beneath them. "Dad, I saw the video." There was a long silence on the line, and Marcus felt something inside him collapse. Jamal's voice tightened. "Why didn't you call me?" Marcus tried to respond, but every word tangled in his throat. The father in him wanted to speak strength. The man in him wanted to hide. The soldier in him wanted to stay silent. but none of those versions could match the truth he needed to say. "I didn't want you to worry." The reply came fast, nearly sharp. "You're my father. I'm supposed to worry." That exchange, simple as it was, broke Marcus open. It laid bare decades of fear, pride, and restraint. Jamal continued, voice steadier now. "I put in for emergency leave. I'll be home soon." Marcus didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes, breathed slowly, and said the words he had not said in 30 years. "I need you here." When Jamal landed at Norfolk Airport hours later, he didn't carry luggage. He didn't change out of his uniform. He moved through the terminal with the urgency of a man who had spent the entire flight replaying the video in his mind. When he reached Suffolk, he walked straight into his father's house without knocking. Marcus stood in the living room, shoulders bent, trying to appear composed. Jamal didn't say anything. He simply stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father, holding him in a way neither of them had done since Jamal was a small boy. The moment lingered. Marcus tried to stay strong, but the months of therapy, the years of trauma, and the humiliation of that night all pressed against him at once. His breath broke, his body shook, and for the first time since Evelyn died, he let himself cry in someone else's arms. Jamal held him tighter, whispering, "It's all right. Dad, I've got you. You're not alone." Meanwhile, the officers involved faced a different kind of storm. Barrett's name leaked online. Comments flooded his social media pages until they shut down. Emails poured into the department demanding his suspension. Death threats arrived from anonymous accounts, pushing the police chief to assign protection. Barrett's patrol car was moved out of sight. His desk was cleared. He denied wrongdoing through the department spokesperson. But the video contradicted every carefully rehearsed line. Crocker fared no better. His radio call labeling the stop as high risk came under scrutiny when records showed Marcus had obeyed every order until the spray hit his face, inside the Suffolk precinct. Tension rose. Officers whispered. Commanders argued behind closed doors. Civilian review boards demanded answers. The mayor called an emergency meeting. Pressure built from every direction. In the middle of all this, Marcus stayed quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of a man gathering strength. Every knock at the door made him sit up straighter. Every news segment made him listen a little longer. Every protest sign made something in his chest shift. The world had taken his voice and made it visible again. And with Jamal beside him, steady and unwavering, Marcus could feel a different future forming. A future where the video was not just an echo of pain, but the beginning of a fight he never planned to start and no longer intended to walk away from. When the firestorm finally settled into something steady, Marcus found himself seated across from Maya Chen in a quiet conference room at the ACLU office, his hands clasped tightly together as she explained the long road ahead. Maya was direct, steady, and calm in a way Marcus appreciated. She spoke with the precision of someone who had spent years tearing down complicated legal walls, and she began by telling him the truth he needed to hear. "What happened to you was unconstitutional," she said, "and we're going to fight this. But the system does not make this easy." Marcus nodded, unsure if he was ready for a fight of any kind. He had spent his life avoiding conflict whenever possible, staying silent to survive the deepest wounds of his past. But when Maya placed the printed complaint in front of him, his name at the top, the details of the stop, the violence he endured, the demand for relief, he felt a steadiness inside he had not felt in years. She told him they would file a civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983, seeking $750,000 in damages for excessive force, false detention, and the violation of his constitutional rights. Marcus listened closely, absorbing each word as though learning a language he never expected to speak. Maya warned him that the police would claim qualified immunity, a doctrine that often shielded officers from accountability unless they violated clearly established law. She cautioned him that most cases never made it past that barrier. "Still," she said, "your video gives us something powerful. It shows the truth." When the lawsuit was filed, Suffolk moved fast to defend its officers. Barrett's attorneys submitted motions claiming Marcus ignored commands, escalated the situation, and forced the officers to respond as they did. They argued that Barrett feared for his safety. They insisted that Crocker acted properly. They said the stop was justified because of a suspicious temporary plate. But the video told another story, one that could not be softened or reinterpreted. In it, Marcus's voice trembled with fear, not aggression. His hands stayed outside the window. His compliance was clear, and the pepper spray burst came without warning. Still, the city insisted the officers were protected by qualified immunity. Arguing no reasonable officer could have known their behavior violated a clearly established right. The first hearing in federal court felt like stepping into another battlefield for Marcus. The courtroom was quiet, the air heavy with tension as attorneys argued over the meaning of reasonable force. Barrett sat at the defense table, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed forward. Crocker kept his gaze lowered. Marcus sat beside Maya, trying to breathe evenly, trying to stay grounded. The judge listened carefully, interrupting the lawyers when their arguments grew too vague or too polished. When Maya played the video aloud, the room shifted, the sound of Marcus begging, the spray hitting his face, his scream breaking. Those moments filled the silent space, pulling every eye toward the screen. For a moment, even Barrett seemed to flinch, but legal battles are not won on emotion alone. When the judge issued his ruling weeks later, it cut straight through the tension. Partial immunity granted, partial denied. The court dismissed the claim for unlawful arrest, saying the officers had arguable probable cause. It dismissed the claim for excessive force in the initial stop, calling it debatable among reasonable officers, but it allowed two claims to move forward: assault and illegal search. Those claims would be decided by a jury. Marcus felt the weight of that ruling like a blow to the chest. It meant most of what happened to him would never be heard in front of a jury. It meant qualified immunity had shielded the officers from full accountability. Maya explained it gently, telling him they had expected this outcome. "This system," she said softly, "was built to make cases like yours hard to win." The trial preparation pushed Marcus into conversations he never imagined having. Maya walked him through each moment of the stop, asking him to describe the sounds, the pain, the fear. She told him what to expect on the stand. She told him the defense would try to twist his words, try to frame him as unstable, try to use his PTSD against him. The thought made his stomach tighten. He had spent years hiding his trauma from everyone except Evelyn. Now he would be forced to speak openly about it in a courtroom full of strangers. The night before the trial, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Barrett's hand lifting the spray. Every time he breathed deeply, the flashbacks returned. He sat on the edge of his bed, hands trembling, whispering to Evelyn in the dark. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, "but I'll try." On the morning of his testimony, Marcus walked into the courtroom with his shoulders squared but his heart pounding. When Maya called him to the stand, he felt the weight of every pair of eyes watching him. The judge instructed him to raise his hand, and the oath felt heavier than anything he had carried in uniform. Maya guided him through the events of that night. She kept her voice steady and respectful, giving him space to breathe between answers. But when she asked him to describe the moment the pepper spray hit his face, something inside him cracked. He pictured the burst of light, the burning pain, the sounds of shouting, and the concrete rushing toward him. His breath grew fast and shallow. His eyes blinked rapidly. The edges of his vision tightened. The room seemed to shrink. Maya paused, her voice dropping gently. "Take your time. But time did not help. The panic rose too quickly. His fingers gripped the sides of the witness stand. His chest tightened. His throat closed. He heard the judge say, "We're taking a recess," and everything inside him blurred. The bailiff stepped forward. Maya came to his side. He was helped to a quiet hallway as he tried to pull air into his lungs, but each breath shook. Someone handed him a paper bag. He leaned forward, breathing slowly into it, trying to push back the memory that had overtaken him. A flashback. The doctor had once called it a familiar terror, a shadow from Iraq merging with the violence at the gas station. When he finally calmed enough to speak, his voice was hoarse. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Maya, as though he had failed her. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't apologize for surviving," she said softly. The courtroom reconvened after a short break. Marcus took the stand again. Hands steadier now, voice quiet but clear. The defense attorney questioned him sharply, trying to suggest he misunderstood the officer's intentions. Trying to imply fear made him overreact. Each question felt like a small cut. But Marcus answered honestly. He did not exaggerate. He did not falter. He told the truth the way he experienced it, not the way the defense wanted him to recall it. When his testimony ended, he stepped down from the stand, feeling drained but resolute. The trial lasted 3 days. When it ended, the judge offered a brief explanation of the next steps and dismissed the jury to deliberate. Marcus sat in the hallway with Maya and Jamal, waiting in a silence that felt heavier than any moment before. Hours passed. Reporters gathered outside the building. Officers paced the corridors. Finally, the bailiff appeared with a nod. The jury was ready when the verdict was read. It confirmed a truth Marcus had long suspected about the justice system. Victories for men like him often came in pieces. The jury found the officers liable for assault and illegal search, but the damages awarded were small, far smaller than the pain he carried. Still, Maya leaned close and whispered, "This is not the end. This is only the beginning." Marcus nodded. Knowing she was right, they had won a piece of the truth. And now they would take the fight higher. The appeals court waited. The future waited. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt since Evelyn's hand rested in his own. He felt determined. The appeal was filed quietly, without fanfare or cameras. Yet it carried the weight of every sleepless night Marcus had endured since the attack. Maya explained that the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit was not a place for theatrics. It was a place for precision, history, and precedent. She told him this appeal would challenge the ruling that protected Officer Barrett under qualified immunity. She told him it was a long shot, the kind most plaintiffs never win. But she also told him something that stayed with him. "Your case has something courts rarely get," she said, "clarity. The video is undeniable, and qualified immunity isn't supposed to be a shield for obvious harm." Marcus listened, nodding quietly, trying to steady himself against the hope rising inside him. He had learned to distrust hope. Too many things in his life had reminded him that hope was a fragile thing for a black veteran. But the appeal represented a kind of justice he had never imagined fighting for. It was no longer just about his pain. It was about the next man who would be stopped in the dark, the next veteran who would whisper, "Don't hurt me," and hope the world listened. When the briefing stage began, Maya worked late into the night drafting arguments that read like a ledger of everything stolen from Marcus: his dignity, his safety, his voice, and the trust he had carried into every uniformed interaction. She wrote with clarity, citing case after case, showing how previous courts had ruled on unreasonable seizures and excessive force. She highlighted the video frame by frame, noting the moment Marcus raised his hands, the moment Barrett aimed the spray, the moment the concrete met Marcus's face. She placed each fact under the legal microscope and left no room for ambiguity. Her argument was simple. Barrett's actions violated clearly established constitutional rights, and qualified immunity should not apply. The city responded with equal force, claiming the officers acted reasonably, insisting the night was chaotic, and arguing the courts should show deference to law enforcement judgment. They painted Marcus as unpredictable, suggesting his PTSD made him react in ways officers could have perceived as threatening. Reading those words caused something hot to rise in Marcus's chest. Maya placed a hand on his forearm. "They're trying to make you the reason for your own assault," she said, "but they don't get to rewrite what we all saw." When the oral argument date was set, Marcus traveled with Maya and Jamal to Richmond. The courthouse felt imposing and cold, its stone pillars rising like sentinels guarding the law. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than he expected, almost intimate, with 3 judges seated high above, robes flowing like dark wings. They listened without expression, eyes sharp as they scanned the attorneys below. Maya stood first. Her voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of professionalism and conviction. She laid out the facts. She walked the judges through the video, second by second. She emphasized the clarity of the constitutional violation. At one point, one of the judges leaned forward and asked, "Counsel, what reasonable officer would spray a compliant man with his hands out the window?" Maya paused for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she answered, "None." "Your Honor, and that is precisely why qualified immunity cannot apply." The room went still. The city's attorney spoke afterward, but the judge's questions came fast and pointed. They pushed back against hypothetical scenarios. They challenged the notion that unclear commands excused violent force. They returned again and again to the video. It felt, for the first time, as though the truth was not slipping through Marcus's fingers. When the argument ended, Maya turned to him and whispered, "Whatever happens, you stood your ground today." Jamal placed a steady hand on his father's shoulder, grounding him in a moment Marcus knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Weeks passed with no word. Marcus tried to go about his routines: morning coffee, quiet afternoons, slow walks. But there was an undercurrent of tension running through him. He replayed the hearing in his mind. He replayed the stop itself. He replayed the silence that followed Evelyn's passing and the way his life had shifted since posting the video. Some days he wondered if he had gone too far. Other days he wondered if he had not gone far enough. He reminded himself that fights like this were not fought for comfort. They were fought for change. When the Fourth Circuit ruling finally arrived, it came in a thin envelope, the kind that looked too small to carry anything meaningful. Maya called before he opened it. "Are you sitting down?" she asked. Marcus swallowed hard. "Yes." She exhaled once. "We won." The court had stripped qualified immunity from Officer Barrett for unreasonable seizure. They wrote that any reasonable officer should have known that a compliant man, with hands visible and no signs of threat, could not be sprayed and dragged out of his vehicle without violating the Constitution. They recognized the clarity of harm. They recognized the clarity of the video. They recognized the humanity that had been ignored that night. For the first time, the law recognized Marcus. He held the ruling in his hands, reading the words again and again, not because he doubted them, but because the weight of them settled so deeply into him that he needed time to absorb the truth. The courts saw him, they believed him, and they agreed he had been wronged. A retrial was ordered, this time, with qualified immunity off the table. The city had to defend its actions on the merits alone. In the second trial, the jury selection included 3 veterans, 2 from the Army, 1 from the Air Force. Each listened closely as the evidence was presented. Marcus sat through the proceedings with a new steadiness. He no longer felt invisible. He no longer felt like a man pleading for acknowledgement. He felt like a witness to his own truth when he testified again. His voice trembled only once. Jamal sat behind him, shoulders squared, offering silent support. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdict was read calmly, almost quietly. Liability confirmed. Damages awarded. $4,500. A number so small it barely reflected the cost of the medical bills, let alone the trauma. Marcus stared at the paper, unsure how to react. Then Maya leaned close and said softly, "This isn't about the money. This verdict changes the law for thousands of people. You helped open a door that was locked for decades." The reality sank in slowly. He had not won a fortune, but he had won something far larger. Barrett was fired the same afternoon, and across the Fourth Circuit, the precedent set by Marcus's case would stand like a marker in the law, a reminder that compliance should mean safety, not suffering. As he walked out of the courthouse into the soft afternoon light, Marcus closed his eyes briefly. The wind brushed his face, and for the first time in years, his breathing felt full and steady. He thought of Evelyn. He thought of the men he served with. He thought of every veteran who would one day stand behind the shield he helped create. And he whispered into the air, with quiet resolve. It mattered. The consequences for Officer Kyle Barrett did not arrive with the loud crash of punishment he once imagined for others, but with the slow, grinding unraveling of a life built on unchecked power. The moment the Fourth Circuit stripped his qualified immunity and the retrial verdict confirmed his liability, the Suffolk Police Department moved with surprising speed. He was ordered to surrender his badge, his firearm, and his patrol car keys before he even left the courthouse. The announcement came not with ceremony, but with a simple statement from the chief. Officer Barrett's actions violated departmental standards and the public trust. Barrett had spent 12 years believing the system would always protect him, believing his behavior would always be justified, believing the uniform would always shield him. But in the weeks that followed, the shield cracked, his legal fees ballooned, his marriage collapsed under the strain of public outrage, media scrutiny, and the cold silence that filled his home. His wife filed for divorce. His children refused to speak to him. The town that once saw him as a symbol of authority now crossed the street when he walked by. And the final blow came when the Department of Justice, conducting its own investigation prompted by Marcus's case, issued a consent decree permanently barring him from working in law enforcement anywhere in the country for the first time. Barrett confronted a world where his badge could no longer protect him, and he had no one to blame but himself. After the firing, he moved 2 counties away, trying to escape the shadow of the verdict, but the shadow followed him. He ended up living in a battered trailer on a dirt road, paying rent month to month, surrounded by other men who had once believed they were untouchable. Some mornings he sat outside on a metal chair, staring at the ground, wondering how a moment he thought would be forgotten had become the moment that defined him. He had convinced himself for years that his actions were justified, that force was necessary, that fear excused cruelty. But as the isolation grew thicker, he was forced to confront the truth he had spent years avoiding. It wasn't the badge that made him powerful. It was the silence of the people he encountered, the silence of those who didn't fight back, the silence of those who didn't post videos, the silence of men like Marcus, who had swallowed injustice for decades. And now that silence had ended. The price of the badge had become the cost of losing everything. Sergeant David Harlan faced his own reckoning, though of a different kind. He had served beside Barrett for years, often watching with unease as Barrett escalated routine stops and treated black drivers with distrust. Harlan was a former Marine who had fought beside black soldiers in combat, men who saved his life more than once, men he trusted with every breath. He knew what honor meant. He knew what loyalty meant. And when he watched Marcus's video, he felt something twist inside his chest. It was not shock. It was recognition. He knew the tone in Barrett's voice. He had seen that tone before, and he knew he could not stay silent. When Maya Chen approached him asking for testimony during the internal investigation, he agreed without hesitation. He told the truth. He testified that Marcus had not resisted, that Barrett escalated unnecessarily, that the force used that night was never justified. His statement helped push the DOJ investigation forward. It helped expose the pattern of conduct Barrett had kept hidden behind the shield of officer discretion, and it helped give Marcus something rare in cases like this, a witness from inside the system. But telling the truth cost Harlan deeply. He was no hero inside the precinct. Some officers called him a traitor. Others stopped speaking to him entirely. He found his lunch table empty, his locker dented, his tires slashed one morning in the parking lot. His reputation inside the department had shifted overnight, and he felt the cold weight of ostracism settle over him. Yet something else happened too. For the first time in years, he slept through the night. The guilt that had been pressing on him, quiet, constant, unwanted, finally loosened its grip. He told Maya later, "I didn't do it for him. I did it for myself. I did it for the men I served with overseas. They would have expected better from me." His voice cracked when he said it. There was no pride in his words, only relief, for a man who had survived real battlefields. The moral one had been harder to walk, but he walked it anyway. The Suffolk Police Department changed as well. The retrial verdict and DOJ intervention forced reforms the city had postponed for years. Mandatory bias training became non-negotiable. Body cameras were replaced with models that could not be muted, disabled, or conveniently turned off during sensitive moments. Traffic stop policies were rewritten to prevent officers from initiating stops based on vague suspicions or minor plate issues. Supervisors were required to review use-of-force reports with greater scrutiny, and a brand-new civilian oversight board was established to evaluate complaints, ensuring citizens, especially black residents who had long felt unheard, could finally speak without fear of retaliation. These reforms did not erase the past, but they marked a shift in a department long resistant to change. For older officers, the transition was uncomfortable. For younger ones, it felt overdue, and for the community, it felt like a first step toward rebuilding trust. When Marcus learned Barrett had been fired, bankrupt, and banned from law enforcement, he felt no triumph. He felt no satisfaction. He sat at his kitchen table, hands folded, staring at the letter from Maya explaining the final outcome. Jamal stood behind him quietly, watching his father process the news. Marcus whispered, "I never wanted to ruin him. I just wanted to be treated like a man." Jamal placed a hand on his father's shoulder, grounding him the way Marcus had once grounded him. "You didn't ruin him, Dad. He ruined himself." Those words settled into Marcus with a deep, steady truth. The fight had never been personal. It had been about dignity. It had been about the next black veteran pulled over at night. It had been about the silence he carried for decades finally breaking open into something meaningful. As the reforms took effect, Maya invited Marcus to speak at a small gathering of civil rights advocates. He declined the public spotlight but agreed to meet privately with a group of black veterans at the VA. When he sat in that room, men with worn hands, tired eyes, and stories buried deep, he felt a quiet strength echo through the walls. He told them what happened. He told them what he felt. He told them why he chose to fight. And when he finished, one of the older veterans leaned forward and said, "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us." Marcus nodded, breathing slowly, feeling the truth ripple through him. He had carried a heavy silence for too long. But now, at last, he knew that breaking it had not been for nothing. The price of the badge had been paid by the man who misused it, and the price of silence had been lifted from the man who survived it. Marcus never imagined the end of this journey would feel quiet, not victorious, not triumphant. Quiet. A kind of stillness he had not known since the years when Evelyn's laughter filled the house and the world felt steady beneath his feet. After the verdict, after Barrett's firing, after the reforms and headlines faded, Marcus woke each morning with a different kind of weight. Lighter, but unfamiliar. It was the weight of a man who had spoken after a lifetime of silence. The weight of a man who finally understood that justice does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the smallest cracks in the system, leaving marks that will outlive the men who fought for them. He spent the first few weeks avoiding crowds, avoiding cameras, avoiding reporters who wanted to turn him into a symbol. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to breathe. He wanted to heal. And in that healing, he felt something shift. He no longer carried the shame of what happened that night. He no longer replayed the moment of the pepper spray with the same crushing panic. The fear still lived inside him, but it no longer led him. He stood straighter. He walked steadier. He was still here. And that meant something. When the major networks called asking for interviews, he turned them down. CNN, MSNBC, national papers. All wanted the same thing, the emotional testimony of a man wronged. But he refused to let his pain become entertainment. He chose instead to speak only in places where his words could rest without being exploited. He contacted the local VA and asked for a room. Nothing fancy. Just a space where veterans gathered for weekly meetings. The first night he walked in, a dozen black veterans sat around the table. Old men with slow steps and younger ones with restless hands. Some were amputees. Some carried scars across their faces. Some had eyes that flickered whenever they heard loud sounds. They recognized Marcus instantly, not from the news, but from the look in his eyes. The look of a man who had been hurt, survived, and struggled to find meaning in the aftermath. When he sat down, he didn't give a speech. He didn't rehearse. He simply said, "You know what it feels like to be invisible. You know what it feels like to be stopped for no reason. You know what it feels like to swallow things that should never be swallowed." The room was silent for a long moment. Then one man nodded, then another, and soon the silence shifted, not into noise, but into understanding. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't cry. He spoke gently, steadily, like a man sharing a truth he had finally learned to carry without collapsing under its weight. When he finished, the room felt lighter, and so did he. With time, he and Jamal created a small legal aid fund for service members who faced discrimination during traffic stops and routine encounters. They didn't have much money, but they had purpose. They called it the Thompson Fund, a modest name for a modest beginning. It started with a few $1,000s and a few volunteers, but it grew faster than they expected. Veterans reached out from across Virginia. Some shared their stories. Some asked for help. Some simply wanted a place to be heard. Marcus listened to every call. He wrote letters. He attended hearings quietly, sitting in the back, offering silent support to men and women who reminded him of himself. He understood that justice was not a single verdict. It was a long, steady effort to hold doors open so others could walk through without fear. As the months passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Marcus cooked meals he had not made since Evelyn was alive. He sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the slow drift of clouds, letting his lungs fill with air that no longer felt tight. He still had nightmares. He still woke sweating some nights, reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. But when he did, he reminded himself of something Evelyn used to tell him. You don't have to carry it alone. And for the first time, that felt true. Jamal called often, checking on him with the firmness of a son who had grown into the man his father always hoped he would become. They talked about simple things: weather, work, memories of Evelyn. But every conversation carried a note of gratitude. They had survived something together, something that reshaped the bond between them. One afternoon, when the wind swept across Suffolk with a gentle chill, Marcus decided to visit the cemetery. He put on his old uniform jacket. He didn't wear it for pride. He wore it for her. The fabric still carried faint hints of the life they had shared. The creases she used to smooth, the threads she once repaired with careful hands. He drove slowly, breathing through the echoes of the past that rose with each familiar turn. When he reached Evelyn's headstone, he stood still for a long moment before kneeling down. The grass was soft. The flag beside her marker fluttered in the breeze. He traced his fingers over her name, reading it the way he had 1,000 times. But today, the grief felt different, not as sharp, not as consuming, more like a quiet ache woven into the fabric of who he had become. He removed his old lieutenant's cap from under his arm and placed it gently by the headstone. The cap was worn, the metal bar at the front slightly scratched from the night at the Exxon station. He stared at it, remembering how he once polished it before deployments, how he saved it after retirement as a reminder of the man he had been. He touched the insignia now with a slow, deliberate gesture, as though granting himself permission to feel everything he had avoided for so long. Then, with a breath that trembled just slightly, he whispered. I finally used my voice. Baby. The wind lifted, brushing softly against his cheek. The small American flag next to her grave snapped sharply in the breeze, standing tall and unwavering. In that moment, Marcus felt no anger, no shame, no fear, only gratitude that he had lived long enough to speak, long enough to be heard, and long enough to understand that survival is not silence. It is truth spoken at the right time, with the right strength, for the right purpose. He rose slowly, adjusted the jacket she once loved seeing him wear, and looked across the rows of headstones, each marking a life that had carried burdens, fought battles, and left legacies behind. He stood taller, shoulders square, eyes steady. He was still breathing. He was still standing. And for the first time, he knew he was standing not just for himself, but for every soldier who had ever whispered, I'm afraid to get shot, and hoped someone cared enough to listen. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please subscribe and give the video a like.